The handcuffs clicked shut before anyone bothered to ask her name. Metal on bone. Cold. Final. The sound echoed off the limestone columns of Hawthorne Country Club, sharp enough to slice through the afternoon chatter. A few heads turned, a few didn't. Most people pretended not to notice. That was easier. The girl didn't resist. She didn't cry out. She just stood there, shoulders squared. Breath, shallow eyes fixed straight ahead, as if she were memorizing the place. The iron gates, the American flag snapping in the wind, the line of luxury sedans idling near the circular drive. She was 17, black, dressed in a navy cardigan and worn flats. And at that exact moment, every assumption in the air had already decided who she was. A liar, a trespasser, a problem to be removed quietly. Richard Hawthorne Jr. watched from a few steps back, hands resting comfortably in the pockets of his tailored blazer. His mouth curved into something between a smile and relief, not joy. Satisfaction, the kind a man feels when the mess he created is finally being taken away by someone else. "I told you," he said, voice calm, almost bored, as if he were explaining a delayed tea time. "This is what happens when people make things up." The security officer didn't look at him. He avoided eye contact entirely. His grip on the girl's arm tightened just slightly more from nerves than force. The girl finally spoke. "You're making a mistake." Her voice was steady. Too steady, not defiant, not pleading, just a statement. It landed awkwardly in the space between them like a dropped glass that hadn't shattered yet. Richard laughed, a soft sound. Polite, performative. "Sweetheart," he said, tilting his head. "You don't get to decide that." A few feet away, an older woman in tennis whites shifted uncomfortably. She had been sipping iced tea moments ago. Now her cup trembled in her hand. She leaned toward her husband and whispered, "This feels wrong." He shook his head without looking at her. "Not our business." That phrase hung heavy. Not our business. It had protected a lot of people for a long time. The patrol car idled near the curb lights, off but engine running. Not an arrest. Not officially. Just a temporary hold, they said. Standard procedure. Words chosen carefully. Clean words, safe words. Words that kept everyone comfortable. The officer guiding the girl toward the car cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we're just going to verify some information." "I know," the girl said. She glanced once over her shoulder, not at the officer, not at Richard, but at the building itself. The club. The place her grandfather had once walked into, wearing his Sunday suit hat, in hand, daring to belong when the world told him he shouldn't. Richard noticed that look. Something about it unsettled him. Not fear, not anger, recognition. As if she weren't seeing a country club, but a ledger. An unfinished account. "Let's move this along," he said quickly. "The board meeting starts in a few minutes." That was the truth beneath everything. Time. He was running out of it. Inside the clubhouse, the hallways were cool and dim, lined with oil portraits and polished brass plaques. Generations of men stared down from the walls, faces, stern names etched in gold. Hawthorne, Ellis, Whitman, Carter. One chair in the boardroom sat empty. It always had. Dust gathered there, undisturbed, as if the room itself had learned to forget. Richard took his seat at the long mahogany table, exhaled, and straightened his cufflinks. He told himself the distraction at the gate was over. Handled. The meeting could proceed as planned. The paperwork was ready. The vote would be clean, legal, final. But even as he reviewed the agenda, his mind replayed the sound of that voice. "You're making a mistake." He shook it off. Teenagers said things like that all the time. Drama, delusion. He had seen it before. Kids with stories, with documents they didn't understand, with names they borrowed because they sounded important. And yet. Down the hallway, the glass doors swung open. Helen Brooks. The board chair entered briskly, reading glasses perched low on her nose. She paused just inside the room, scanning the table. "Where's Reynolds?" she asked. "Running late," Richard replied too quickly. "Traffic." Helen nodded, unconvinced. She took her seat, set her leather folder down, and tapped it, once a habit, from decades of running meetings where men twice her size learned to listen. "Before we begin," she said, "I want the record to reflect that we received a formal notice of objection this morning." Richard froze. "Objection?" Thomas Drake asked, leaning back in his chair. From whom? Helen adjusted her glasses. From the Carter Family Trust. The room shifted. Subtle but unmistakable. A cough. A chair scraping slightly. Someone sat up straighter. Richard forced a chuckle. That must be a mistake. There hasn't been an active Carter representative in years." Helen's gaze sharpened. "Active doesn't mean non-existent." "She's a minor," Richard said, heat creeping into his voice. "Whoever filed that notice is playing games." Helen held his stare longer than necessary. The notice was filed by a licensed attorney. It was time-stamped, properly served. And, unless I'm mistaken, our bylaws are very clear about what happens next. Silence. Across the table, George Whitman slowly folded his hands. His skin was paper-thin now, spotted with age, but his eyes were still sharp. He had been quiet for most meetings these days, listening, remembering. "William Carter would have hated this," he murmured. Richard snapped his head toward him. "With all due respect, George, this isn't about history. It's about moving forward." George looked up. "History is exactly what you're trying to erase." Outside, the patrol car door opened. The girl stepped out, uncuffed now, but not free. An officer spoke quietly into his radio. His posture had changed. Less certain. Less sure of who was in charge. The girl stood on the pavement, hands clasped in front of her, breathing slow-controlled. She could hear the muffled thrum of voices from inside the building. The meeting had begun without her. That was expected. What she didn't expect was the feeling in her chest. Not fear, not anger, something heavier. Like standing at the edge of a river she had been warned about her entire life, finally understanding its depth. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. One message. "Hold steady. They can't vote yet." She closed her eyes for half a second, then looked up at the clubhouse doors as they began to open. Inside, Richard Hawthorne Jr. felt it, before he understood it. The subtle shift in the room, the air tightening, the sense that the story he thought he controlled was no longer his to tell. For the first time that afternoon, the confidence drained from his face. Not because he knew who the girl was, but because he was beginning to realize how many people were about to find out. The doors closed behind her with a muted thud, the kind designed to keep noise out and secrets in. Evelyn Carter stood just inside the corridor, the chill of polished marble seeping through the thin soles of her flats. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and old money. Somewhere deeper inside the building, voices rose and fell, controlled, measured, confident. The boardroom. She didn't need signs. She could feel it. An officer lingered a few steps behind her, uncertain now. His radio crackled softly, then went silent. He rubbed the back of his neck and glanced toward the security desk, as if waiting for someone else to take responsibility. "You can wait here," he said, not unkindly. It sounded like a question. Evelyn nodded once. She didn't sit. She didn't lean against the wall. She stood the way her grandmother had taught her, feet planted, spine straight, hands calm. Stillness, Evelyn. When people rush, you wait. Waiting unnerves them. Down the hall, a framed photograph caught her eye. Black and white. A ribbon cutting. Men in suits smiling stiffly at the camera. One man stood half a step apart, hat tucked under his arm posture, proud but cautious. William Carter Sr., her grandfather, younger than she remembered him from the few photos at home, taller, sharper, very much alive. She stared at the photograph until the faces around him blurred, until the noise in her chest settled into something colder, something steadier. Inside the boardroom, the meeting was unraveling faster than Richard Hawthorne Jr. expected. "The objection is procedural," he said, leaning forward, palms flat on the table. "It doesn't negate our ability to proceed. The trust hasn't exercised its rights in over a decade." Thomas Drake nodded eagerly. "That's correct. We've sent notices. We've waited. This club can't be held hostage by an absentee stake." Helen Brooks did not look at either of them. She was reading. Slowly, each page deliberate. The room waited for her to speak. George Whitman broke the silence instead. "William Carter wasn't absentee," he said. His voice trembled, but not with age, with restraint. He was pushed out, quietly. Same way you're trying to push his granddaughter aside now. Richard's jaw tightened. "There is no granddaughter." George's eyes lifted. "You sure about that?" Before Richard could answer, the door opened. Not fully, just enough. A young associate from the legal firm slipped inside, breath, slightly uneven tie loosened. He held a tablet in both hands, as if it were heavier than it looked. "Madam Chair," he said, nodding to Helen. "Thomas Reynolds has arrived. He's requesting immediate access." Richard shot to his feet. On what grounds? Helen finally looked up. Her gaze pinned him where he stood. "On the grounds that you tried to vote without him." A murmur rippled around the table. Chairs shifted. Someone exhaled sharply. Moments later, Thomas Reynolds entered calm as stone. He was not tall, not imposing. His power came from precision, from the way he moved, as if every step had been measured in advance. Behind him, Evelyn Carter walked into the room. The conversation stopped mid-breath. She did not look at Richard. Not yet. She looked at the empty chair, the one with dust still clinging to the leather, the brass nameplate beneath it. Carter. Something tightened in George Whitman's chest. He stood without realizing he was moving. "William's girl," he whispered. "You have his eyes." Evelyn met his gaze and inclined her head slightly. Respectful, not familiar. She didn't know him. She just knew what he represented. Richard found his voice at last. "This is highly irregular." Thomas Reynolds stepped forward. "So was detaining my client at your front gate. She's a minor." Richard snapped. "She has no authority here." Reynolds didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "She is the sole beneficiary of the Carter family trust. Her legal incapacity does not invalidate her ownership. It only delays her vote." Helen folded her hands. "And the objection," Reynolds slid a document across the table, "filed in accordance with your bylaws, triggered the moment she arrived on property." Richard stared at the paper as if it might burst into flames. "That's absurd." "Read the fine print," Reynolds said softly. "Your predecessors did." Silence pressed in, heavy, unforgiving. Evelyn remained standing. She felt every eye on her now, measuring, judging, recalculating. She had expected hostility. What unsettled her was the fear, not hers. Theirs. Richard finally looked at her, really looked, not at her clothes, not at her age, at the certainty in her posture, the absence of apology in her eyes. "You think this changes anything?" he said. "You don't even know what you're walking into." Evelyn turned to him slowly. "I know exactly what this place is," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried. "I grew up hearing stories about it. The good ones. The ones you tell new members. And the quiet ones. The ones you don't. Richard scoffed. This is not a courtroom. No, Evelyn replied. It's worse. Courtrooms have rules everyone can see. A few heads dipped. Someone cleared their throat. Helen leaned back, studying Evelyn with a different kind of attention now. Miss Carter, she said, what is it you're asking for? Evelyn didn't hesitate. To be recorded as present, to have the objection acknowledged, and to stop pretending this meeting can move forward without us. Thomas Drake laughed sharp and nervous. Us Reynolds answered for her. The Carter Trust. Drake's smile faltered. You're one teenager. Evelyn met his eyes. I'm a reminder. The room shifted again, subtly, irreversibly. Helen exhaled. Then here's what we'll do. The objection stands. The vote is suspended pending full legal review. Richard slammed his hand on the table. You can't do that. Helen's voice hardened. I just did. George Whitman lowered himself back into his chair, heart pounding. He hadn't felt this alive in years. Terrified, relieved, ashamed, all at once. Richard looked around the table, searching for support. He found none. Not anymore. Evelyn turned toward the window. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the golf course. Perfect greens, carefully manicured lies. She thought of her grandmother waiting at home, of the small kitchen, of the rules she had memorized instead of fairy tales. Never raise your voice, never beg. Let them underestimate you. It buys you time. Time, she realized now, was the only thing Richard Hawthorne Jr. didn't have. As the meeting adjourned in uneasy silence, one thought echoed through the room, unspoken, but undeniable. The girl they had tried to remove quietly had just stopped everything. And she hadn't even sat down yet. Richard Hawthorne Jr. did not sleep that night. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the climate system and the ticking of a grandfather clock he had inherited not earned. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the room over and over. The way the air had changed. The way Helen Brooks had looked at him. Not angry, not disappointed, but alert. As if she had finally noticed something she had ignored for too long. By morning, the story had already begun to move without him. Evelyn Carter woke before her alarm. Pale winter light crept through the blinds of the small apartment she shared with her grandmother. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, steady and grounding. Margaret Carter moved slowly now, arthritis stiff in her hands, but her posture was still firm. She had lived through too many storms to panic over this one. They didn't vote, Margaret said without turning around. That's all that matters. Evelyn nodded, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Yet. Margaret set 2 mugs on the table. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear but from memory. Your grandfather used to say, the most dangerous moment is when people realize you're serious. Across town, Thomas Reynolds sat in his office, reviewing documents with the calm focus of a man preparing for war. He had already placed 3 calls before 8 in the morning. 1 to the club's outside counsel, 1 to a forensic accounting firm, 1 to a journalist he trusted not to sensationalize before the facts were ready. By 9, Richard Hawthorne Jr. was on the phone with Thomas Drake, voice sharp-clipped. This is a stall tactic. That's all it is. Drake hesitated. Helen didn't look like she was stalling. Richard slammed his fist against the desk. She's old. She's sentimental. This Carter thing is a ghost. A ghost with paperwork, Drake muttered. That was when Richard knew. He was losing control of the narrative. At Hawthorne Country Club, the mood had shifted. Quietly, dangerously. Staff whispered behind closed doors. A valet who had worked there for 20 years avoided Richard's eyes. The security supervisor rewrote his incident report twice, careful now with every word. George Whitman arrived early, leaning heavier on his cane than usual. He paused in the lobby, looking up at the portraits lining the walls. Men he had known. Men he had trusted. Men he had failed to challenge when it mattered. "You waited too long," he murmured to no one. Inside a smaller conference room, Helen Brooks sat with Reynolds and two outside attorneys. The documents spread before them were old but meticulous. Trust charters, share certificates, meeting minutes from decades ago. Patterns began to emerge, not dramatic, not illegal on their own, but persistent. They diluted influence without transferring ownership, one attorney said, quietly. Over years. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, and no one stopped it. They assumed no one would come back, Reynolds replied. At noon, Richard demanded a private meeting with Helen. She agreed, but not alone. George Whitman was there. So was Thomas Reynolds. So was a recorder on the table, its red light glowing softly. Richard noticed it immediately. "What's that for?" Helen didn't blink. Transparency. Richard's jaw clenched. "You're overreacting." Helen leaned forward. "You called the police on a 17-year-old girl because she didn't look like she belonged." Richard scoffed. She was trespassing. George's cane tapped sharply against the floor. She was standing where her grandfather once stood, and you know it. Richard turned toward him. "You're confused, nostalgic." George's eyes burned. "Don't you dare." Silence stretched thin. Helen spoke carefully. "We are commissioning a full independent review. Financial, procedural, ethical. Until it's complete, you are relieved of all discretionary authority." Richard laughed brittle and loud. "You can't suspend me without a vote." Helen nodded. "That vote is scheduled for tomorrow morning." For the first time, fear cracked through Richard's composure. "You're making a mistake." Helen's voice was steady. "No, I'm correcting one." That afternoon, Evelyn returned to the club, not through the front gate, through the side entrance, escorted quietly by Reynolds. Heads turned, whispers followed. No one laughed this time. She was led to a smaller room overlooking the practice green. Sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. Reynolds placed a folder on the table and slid it toward her. "Everything you need to know," he said, "and everything they hoped you never would." Evelyn opened it slowly. Emails, internal memos, voting patterns. Her grandfather's name appeared again and again, slowly erased from relevance without ever being removed from record. "They thought time would do the work for them," she said softly. Reynolds nodded. "It almost did." That evening, Richard Hawthorne Jr. sat alone in his study phone, buzzing nonstop. Calls he didn't answer. Messages he didn't read. The walls felt closer than they ever had. His wife stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "What's happening? Nothing," he snapped. "This will pass." She studied him for a long moment. "You sound scared." Richard said nothing. The next morning, the board convened early. No cameras, no press, just men and women who had spent their lives protecting a certain image of themselves. Evelyn did not attend. She didn't need to. The vote was brief, clinical, recorded. Richard Hawthorne Jr. was suspended pending investigation. When he received the call, he didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply sat down, suddenly very tired. The house felt enormous now. Empty. By noon, the first journalist called Evelyn, then another. Reynolds fielded them all, careful, measured. No accusations yet, no headlines, just confirmation. By evening, the Carter Trust's name was restored to the club registry. The empty chair was cleaned, the dust wiped away. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the boardroom later that night alone. The room smelled faintly of wood polish and old paper. She traced the edge of the table, with her fingers stopping at the chair. She did not sit. Not yet. Outside, Richard Hawthorne, Jr., stared at his reflection in the darkened window of his car. For the first time in decades, the future felt uncertain, uncontrolled. He realized then that the girl had never needed to raise her voice. She had only needed to show up, and that he understood too late was the one thing he had never prepared for. The audit began quietly, the way storms do when they don't want to warn you. 2 unmarked sedans arrived at Hawthorne Country Club, just after dawn, their engines barely audible against the morning mist. 3 people stepped out. No suits, no logos, neutral coats. Leather briefcases carried like weight, not accessories. They didn't greet the staff. They didn't smile. They signed in and went straight to the records room. By 10, everyone inside the building knew. Evelyn Carter learned about it from a text Thomas Reynolds sent while she was sitting at the kitchen table, her grandmother across from her hands, folded around a mug that had gone cold. Independent auditors. Full scope. All financial decisions tied to discretionary authority over the last 10 years. Margaret Carter closed her eyes slowly. Your grandfather warned me about men who confuse permission with ownership. Evelyn swallowed. What if they find nothing? Margaret opened her eyes. Then at least the truth will be clean. Inside the club, Richard Hawthorne, Jr. paced his living room phone pressed to his ear, voice sharp and controlled in the way only practiced anger could be. They don't have jurisdiction, he said. This is a private organization. The voice on the other end did not agree. It explained, calmly, methodically. Words like compliance and fiduciary duty and exposure floated through the air landing where excuses used to be. Richard ended the call without saying goodbye. At the club, George Whitman sat in the lounge, watching through the glass as the auditors moved from room to room. His hands trembled not from age, but from the quiet realization of how much had been allowed to rot under the surface. He remembered a meeting years ago, a casual vote, a rushed agenda. Richard leaning over the table, voice friendly, offering to streamline oversight so things could run smoother. Less red tape, fewer voices. Everyone had nodded, including him. You trusted him. Helen Brooks said softly, taking the chair beside George. I trusted the version of him he wanted us to see. George replied. That's on me. Helen watched the auditors disappear down a hallway. It's on all of us. By midday, the mood had shifted from defensive to fragile. A senior accountant was escorted out of the records room, pale jaw clenched. He didn't look at anyone as he passed. At 3, Thomas Reynolds received the first preliminary call. He listened without interrupting, eyes fixed on the window of his office as traffic crawled below. When the call ended, he stayed still for a long moment. Then he stood and drove to the club. Evelyn arrived shortly after, escorted again, this time by Helen Brooks herself. No security, no police. Just 2 women walking side by side through halls that suddenly felt smaller. You don't have to be here, Helen said quietly. Evelyn shook her head. I want to understand what was done in my family's name. The records room smelled like dust and toner. Boxes lined the walls, some opened, some sealed. Papers covered the central table. Color-coded, tagged, flagged. An auditor looked up as they entered. We've identified patterns, she said. Nothing explosive on its own, but consistent, repetitive, profitable. Helen's shoulders stiffened. For whom? The auditor slid a folder forward. For entities linked to Richard Hawthorne, Jr. Shell companies, consulting fees, vendor contracts awarded without competitive bids. Evelyn scanned the documents. The numbers blurred together, but the structure was clear. Money moving in circles. Authority used like a key. This wasn't theft, Evelyn said softly. Not in the obvious way. The auditor nodded. It was extraction. Across town, Richard Hawthorne Jr. sat in his car outside his office building, staring at the doors without opening them. His assistant had texted twice. The firm wanted a meeting. Urgent. He hadn't responded. His phone rang again. This time he answered. Richard Thomas Drake said, voice low, "You need to step back." Richard laughed once. "You too. They're finding things." Drake continued, "Real things. You think I didn't know the risks?" Richard snapped. "This club would have collapsed without my deals." Drake hesitated. "Then why didn't you disclose them?" The line went quiet. Inside the records room, George Whitman reached for a chair. He sat, heavily staring at a set of emails, printed out in chronological order. His name appeared in one of them. A forwarded message. A suggestion he hadn't questioned. "I signed off on this," he whispered. Evelyn looked at him. "You trusted the wrong person. That doesn't make you the villain." George's eyes filled. "It doesn't make me innocent either." Helen placed a hand on his shoulder. "Accountability isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about stopping the damage." By evening, the auditors had enough to issue a preliminary recommendation. Suspension became referral. Referral became disclosure. Disclosure became inevitable. Helen called for an emergency session. Not the boardroom. A smaller space, fewer chairs, no portraits. Richard Hawthorne Jr. was invited. He did not attend. Instead, his attorney arrived, face-tight words rehearsed. "My client denies wrongdoing." The auditor slid a document across the table. "Your client authorized payments to a firm registered under his wife's maiden name." The attorney paused. "I'll need to review this." Reynolds leaned forward. "You'll need to prepare for federal attention." The word hung in the air. That night, Evelyn returned home exhausted. She sat on the edge of her bedshoes, still on staring at the wall. Her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. "You don't know what you've started." She didn't reply. Margaret found her there an hour later. She sat beside her and took her hand. "Power hates daylight," she said. "That's why it tries to scare you back into the dark." Evelyn nodded, eyes closed. "I'm not scared." Margaret squeezed her hand. "Good. But be careful. Courage doesn't mean recklessness." The next morning the headline broke anyway. Not sensational. Not yet. Just enough. Questions raised over governance at Hawthorne Country Club. Richard Hawthorne Jr. read it alone at his kitchen counter. The coffee went cold. The house felt unfamiliar now, like a place he was already leaving. At the club, the empty chair with the Carter nameplate was moved slightly forward. No ceremony, no announcement, just a subtle correction. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched as the room adjusted around that absence, around that presence. The truth was no longer waiting. It was walking. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp and deliberate, the kind that assumed it would be answered. Richard Hawthorne Jr. stood frozen in the hallway, robe still open hair, uncombed, staring at the front door as if it had personally betrayed him. He knew before he moved. The house felt different when the world finally decided to look back at you. He opened the door to two men and a woman, no uniforms, neutral coats, calm eyes. One of them spoke his name like it was already written down somewhere permanent. "Mr. Hawthorne, we'd like to ask you a few questions." Across town, Evelyn Carter sat at the small kitchen table, legal pad, open pen resting between her fingers. She had not slept much. The night had been filled with fragments of conversation, flashes of rooms. She had never been allowed into the weight of names she was still learning to carry. Thomas Reynolds called just after 8. His voice was controlled, but she heard the edge beneath it. "They've made contact," he said. "This is moving faster now." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. With him, yes. Margaret Carter reached across the table and covered Evelyn's hand. "Then it's out of our hands," she said quietly. "That's where truth belongs." At Hawthorne Country Club, the gates stayed closed longer than usual. Members arriving for morning tea times were politely turned away. Maintenance crews worked without explanation. Phones rang unanswered. The illusion of normalcy finally cracked. Helen Brooks stood in the boardroom alone, staring at the table where decisions had been made for decades. She ran her fingers along the wood grain, pausing at the faint mark where someone had once slammed a hand in anger. She wondered how many warnings they had missed, because the numbers looked good. George Whitman arrived shortly after, breathing heavier than usual. They came to his house, he said, not asking. Helen nodded. "I know." George lowered himself into a chair. "I keep thinking about that girl," Helen said. "Yes," George replied. "Her." He swallowed. "I've been here longer than anyone. I saw it change. I told myself progress was slow, that compromise was necessary, that quiet was safer." Helen sat across from him. And now George's voice broke. "Now I see what quiet costs." In a conference room downtown, Richard Hawthorne Jr. sat across from 3 federal investigators. The room was windowless. The table was plain. There were no portraits here, no names on walls, just a recorder placed between them already running. They did not accuse. They asked, "Explain this transfer. Who authorized this contract? Why was this firm selected?" Richard answered carefully. He had always been good at that. Language was his weapon. He spoke of strategy, of long-term value, of market realities. He avoided absolutes. He framed everything as interpretation. The woman across from him listened without interruption. When he finished, she slid a document forward. "This company," she said. "It's registered to your wife's maiden name." Why was it paid consulting fees for projects it did not consult on? Richard's mouth opened, then closed. He felt something shift inside him. Not fear, recognition. He had told this lie so many times he had forgotten it was one. Back at the club, the emergency session reconvened. This time, the press waited outside. Not inside yet, but close enough to be felt. Evelyn arrived quietly escorted by Reynolds. No cameras followed her. The story had outgrown her face for the moment. That was both relief and danger. She sat this time, not in the Carter chair. Still not yet. She sat to the side notebook, open, listening. The auditors presented their findings slowly, methodically. No theatrics, just accumulation, pattern after pattern. Decision after decision, authority leveraged, oversight avoided. When they finished, no one spoke. Helen finally broke the silence. "We will refer all findings to federal authorities. We will cooperate fully." Thomas Drake shifted uncomfortably. "This will destroy the club." Helen's gaze hardened. "It will save it." Drake looked at Evelyn, something like resentment flickering across his face. "Are you satisfied?" Evelyn met his eyes. "I didn't come here for satisfaction." "Then what did you come for?" She didn't answer right away. She thought of her grandfather's hands, thick and scarred, holding hers when she was small. Of the stories he told about doors that never opened unless you pushed hard enough. "I came to make sure no one else had to stand outside and be told they didn't belong," she said. "That's all." The room absorbed that. That afternoon, the suspension became permanent. Richard Hawthorne Jr. was removed from the board by unanimous vote. His name was struck from committees. His discretionary authority revoked retroactively. No cheers followed, just exhaustion. By evening, the story broke fully. Investigators probe financial misconduct at prestigious country club. Richard watched it unfold from his living room, the television casting long shadows across the walls. His phone buzzed once, a message from his wife. I'm taking the kids to my sister's. He didn't respond. At Evelyn's apartment, the doorbell rang. Margaret answered it to find a man holding flowers he clearly did not know what to do with. Delivery for Miss Carter. Evelyn accepted them awkwardly. She didn't recognize the sender. No card, just white lilies. She set them on the counter, unsure what they meant. Apology, warning, distraction. Reynolds arrived later with updates. They're expanding the scope, he said. There are other entities, other complaints. Evelyn nodded. People will come forward now. Yes, he agreed. They always do. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker. Somewhere, a man who had laughed at her was being forced to explain himself in rooms without windows. She did not feel triumphant. She felt older. The next morning, George Whitman asked to see her. They met in the club library shelves, towering leather chairs worn by generations of careful men. I owe you an apology, George said, hands folded tightly. Not for what happened at the gate, for everything before it. Evelyn listened. I saw things, he continued. I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place anymore. Evelyn met his gaze. You're here now. George nodded slowly. That will have to count. Outside, reporters gathered. Questions flew. Accusations sharpened. Helen Brooks stood before them and spoke plainly. No denial, no spin. Just commitment. Evelyn watched from a distance unseen. She felt the weight of what was coming next, pressing in. This was no longer about one man. It never had been. And as the cameras rolled and the gates reopened, one truth settled quietly but firmly into place. Nothing that had been hidden would stay that way. Not anymore. The first lawsuit was filed before the sun finished rising. It didn't come from the club. It didn't come from the board. It came from a name no one at Hawthorne wanted to hear out loud. A former vendor, a minority-owned landscaping firm that had been quietly replaced years earlier. The complaint alleged retaliation breach of contract and racial discrimination. It cited emails, attachments, payment schedules that never materialized. By mid-morning, 3 more followed. Evelyn Carter learned about it while standing in line at the grocery store, basket half-full phone vibrating relentlessly in her pocket. She stepped aside near the magazines no one read anymore, and listened as Thomas Reynolds spoke in a low, measured voice. They're coming forward, he said, not because of you, because of the timing. People sense when a wall has cracked. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. She could picture it. Years of silence, held in place by habit, fear, convenience. All it took was one visible fracture. I didn't ask for this, she said. Reynolds paused. That's how I know you're ready for it. At Hawthorne Country Club, the mood had shifted from damage control to survival. Staff meetings were called without warning. Outside consultants replaced familiar faces. The security desk logged every visitor, every minute, every glance. Helen Brooks moved through the halls with a new weight on her shoulders. Not guilt, responsibility. She had agreed to stay on as chair, not because she wanted to, but because stepping aside now would feel like running. George Whitman followed her into the archive room that afternoon, cane tapping sharply against the tile. They're asking questions I don't have answers for, he said. Helen didn't look up from the documents. Then we tell them we don't. George exhaled slowly. That's new for this place. Helen met his eyes. It should have been old. Across town, Richard Hawthorne Jr. sat in a private conference room with his attorney, sleeves rolled up, tie-loosened face drawn. The bravado was gone. What remained was calculation. They don't have proof of intent, he said. They have patterns. That's not the same. His attorney didn't argue. Patterns are how juries learn to read intent. Richard leaned back, staring at the ceiling. That girl set this off. No, the attorney replied carefully. You did. Richard's phone buzzed again. Another missed call. This one from a number he recognized and didn't want to answer. His wife's sister. He silenced it without reading the message. At the club, Evelyn arrived quietly that afternoon, not announced, not escorted by cameras. She wore a simple coat, hair pulled back, eyes steady. The staff noticed. They always noticed now. She was led to the smaller boardroom, the one without the portraits. Helen and George were already there, along with 2 attorneys, and a woman from an advocacy firm Evelyn hadn't heard of before. We thought it was time you heard this directly, Helen said. The woman introduced herself and slid a folder across the table. Inside were testimonials, statements, names blacked out in places. Stories that echoed each other too closely to ignore. They were told to wait, the woman said, to be patient, to come back later. They did, and later never came. Evelyn turned the pages slowly. Each one felt heavier than the last. She imagined the faces behind the redacted names, the restraint it took to keep showing up where you weren't wanted. They didn't just take money, Evelyn said quietly. They took time. George nodded. And time doesn't get returned. That evening, the press conference happened, whether the board wanted it or not. Helen stood at the podium microphones, angled toward her lights, hot on her face. She spoke plainly. About oversight, about failure, about commitment to transparency. She did not mention Richard by name. She did not need to. Evelyn watched from the back of the room, partially obscured by a pillar. She studied the reporters as they scribbled, the camera operators adjusting focus, the aides whispering last-minute instructions. She saw the hunger there, not for truth, for resolution. They would not get it yet. Later that night, Evelyn sat on her bed, laptop open, documents spread around her like a puzzle still missing pieces. Margaret knocked softly before entering, carrying 2 cups of tea. You don't have to read all of it tonight, she said. Evelyn took the cup. If I don't, someone else will decide what it means. Margaret studied her granddaughter's face. You sound like your grandfather. Evelyn smiled faintly. He taught me not to be in a hurry to speak, just to be ready when it's time. The next morning, a new detail surfaced. An internal memo. Old, buried, addressed to a committee that no longer existed. It referenced a contingency plan, language about consolidating authority in the event of prolonged absence by certain shareholders. Evelyn read it twice. This wasn't opportunism, she said to Reynolds over the phone. It was preparation. Yes, Reynolds replied, which changes everything. At the club, Helen convened a closed session. No press, no observers. Just the remaining board members and counsel. We need to talk about leadership, she said. No one disagreed. Across the city, Richard Hawthorne Jr. was informed of a new development. A civil rights complaint had been filed. Not against the club. Against him personally. He laughed when he heard it. Short, bitter. Of course they did. His attorney did not laugh. This changes your exposure. Richard stood and paced the room. They're turning me into a symbol. You made yourself one, the attorney replied. That afternoon, Evelyn was asked a question she had known was coming. Would you consider a more formal role? Helen asked it carefully. Not as a demand, as an opening. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked around the room, at the faces, some wary, some hopeful, some calculating. I'm not here to replace anyone, she said. I'm here to make sure the system doesn't replace people. Helen nodded. That may be exactly what this place needs. Outside the club, gates stood open, reporters gathered beyond the drive. The world pressed closer, watching, waiting. Evelyn stepped out onto the terrace alone. The late afternoon light softened the sharp edges of the property. For a moment, she could almost imagine the place as her grandfather had hoped it would be. Almost. Her phone buzzed. One message, unknown number. "This isn't over," she typed back without hesitation. "No, it's just begun." And as she slipped the phone back into her pocket, one truth settled fully into her bones. Power did not fear anger. It feared clarity. And clarity once seen could not be unseen. The hearing room smelled like paper and old wood, a place built for patience and attrition. Evelyn Carter sat at the long table, with her hands folded, listening as names were read into the record. Former vendors, employees, contractors, people whose lives had brushed the edges of Hawthorne Country Club and been quietly pushed aside. The clerk's voice was neutral, practiced, but the weight of each name landed all the same. Across the room, Richard Hawthorne Jr. sat with his attorney, posture stiff, jaw clenched. He did not look at Evelyn. He stared straight ahead, as if refusing to acknowledge her would return the world to its previous shape. It wouldn't. The chairwoman of the State Oversight Committee leaned into her microphone. "This is not a criminal proceeding," she said. "Not yet. This is a fact-finding hearing. We are here to understand how power was exercised and how it failed." Evelyn felt the words settle in her chest. Not justice, not revenge. Understanding. That was harder. That required listening. The first witness approached. A man in his late 50s, shoulders rounded from years of physical labor, hands rough and restless. He spoke quietly, eyes fixed on the table. "They told me to rebid," he said. "Every year. Said it was policy. I lowered my price, improved my crew, didn't matter. The contract went to someone else. Same company every time. The attorney asked him to identify the company. He did. It matched the name in Evelyn's notes. Another spoke next, then another. The stories overlapped without copying each other. Different years. Same outcome. Richard shifted in his seat. During a recess, Evelyn stepped into the hallway for air. The marble floors reflected the overhead lights, turning faces into pale ghosts. A reporter approached, cautious, hopeful. "Miss Carter," he said. "Do you believe this was personal?" Evelyn considered the question. "I believe it was convenient," she replied. "Personal comes later when you justify it." He nodded, scribbling, already moving on. Inside the room, George Whitman watched from the back row. He had insisted on being there. Helen Brooks sat beside him, hands clasped tightly, eyes never leaving the witnesses. "This is what accountability sounds like," George whispered. Helen didn't answer. Her throat had closed. When the hearing resumed, Richard's attorney rose. He spoke of complexity, of market forces, of the danger of hindsight. He emphasized that his client had not acted alone, that decisions had been approved, that systems had allowed what individuals could not do by themselves. Evelyn felt a flicker of something then. Not fear, recognition. This was the move. Spread the weight. Dilute responsibility until it disappeared. The chairwoman turned to Evelyn. "Miss Carter, you've been asked to speak. Not as an owner, not as a litigant, as a witness to the process itself." Evelyn stood slowly. The room quieted. She did not look at Richard. She looked at the committee, at the rows behind them, at the people who would read transcripts later and decide what they meant. "I didn't grow up here," she began. "I didn't attend charity dinners or play golf on these lawns. My connection to Hawthorne was a name on a document and stories told at a kitchen table." She paused, letting the room breathe. "When I arrived, I wasn't treated like an heir," she continued. "I was treated like an interruption, something to be handled quickly so the meeting could continue." She felt the eyes on her now, felt the attention sharpen. "That wasn't personal," she said. "It was efficient." Richard's head lifted slightly. Efficiency can look clean, Evelyn said. But it can hide a lot of harm. It doesn't ask who gets left out. It doesn't ask who gets tired of waiting. She glanced briefly toward George, then back to the committee. My grandfather believed institutions should be stronger than the people running them, that if you built something right, it wouldn't depend on who was in charge. Somewhere along the way, that belief was lost. She sat. The room stayed quiet longer than necessary. The chairwoman nodded once. Thank you. Outside the steps, filled with cameras. Evelyn exited through a side door, Reynolds beside her, Margaret, waiting in the car. As they pulled away, Evelyn watched the building recede in the rearview mirror. It felt like standing in a current, she said softly. Margaret smiled. That's because you were. That evening, a new document surfaced. Not leaked. Submitted. A whistleblower report from inside one of Richard Hawthorne Jr.'s shell companies. Detailed. Specific. Impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Reynolds called immediately. This changes the timeline, he said. It shows intent. Evelyn closed her eyes. She had expected relief. Instead, she felt the weight deepen. At Richard's house, the television played quietly in the background. Analysts debated language. Commentators argued over accountability. His phone lay face down on the counter. When he finally looked at it, there were no new messages. His attorney arrived an hour later. They're recommending referral, he said. Criminal. Richard laughed hollow. Because of her, no, the attorney said. Because of you. The next morning, Helen Brooks called Evelyn. Her voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it. Resolve. The board is asking for your presence, she said. Not as an observer. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the worn surface. She looked at her grandmother. What do you think she asked? Margaret took a moment. I think if you don't take the seat, someone else will decide who deserves it. Evelyn nodded. At Hawthorne Country Club, the gates opened to a different kind of day. No press, no ceremony, just a meeting. Necessary, unavoidable. The Carter chair was no longer empty. Evelyn did not rush to it. She stood at the threshold, feeling the gravity of the room pull at her. The portraits on the wall seemed to watch silent witnesses to another turning. George Whitman caught her eye and inclined his head. Respect, not nostalgia, not apology. Recognition. Helen gestured to the seat. Whenever you're ready. Evelyn walked forward and sat. The leather was cool beneath her hands. The table stretched out before her, polished and scarred in equal measure. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Helen cleared her throat. We have work to do. Evelyn exhaled slowly. This was not a victory. This was responsibility. Outside, the world continued to watch, to judge, to speculate. Inside, something older and more fragile was being rebuilt. And as the meeting began, one truth became impossible to ignore. The story was no longer about who had been removed. It was about who would remain and what they would choose to change. The indictment landed on a Tuesday plain white envelope. No ceremony, no relief. Richard Hawthorne Jr. stared at it from the far end of his kitchen, as if it were an animal that might move if he got too close. Wire fraud, conspiracy, abuse of fiduciary duty. The words were clinical, almost polite. They did not mention arrogance. They did not mention contempt. They did not mention the moment he laughed at a girl standing at his gate. They didn't need to. By the time his attorney arrived, Richard had already read it twice. They're offering a window, the attorney said, carefully setting his briefcase down. Limited. Cooperation could matter. Richard didn't look up. They want a confession. They want the truth, the attorney replied. Those aren't always the same thing. Across town, Evelyn Carter sat in the quiet of the boardroom, long after the others had left. The late afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, catching the edges of old scratches in the table. She traced one, with her finger wondering who had made it, and whether they had known what they were carving into. Helen Brooks returned to the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one beside Evelyn without asking. "You don't have to stay this late," Helen said. Evelyn took a sip. It was bitter, strong. "I don't want to forget how this feels." Helen studied her. "Most people want to forget power once they have it." "I want to remember what it costs," Evelyn said. That evening, the press found its way back to the club. Not inside, not yet. But close enough to remind everyone that patience had limits. Headlines sharpened. Commentary grew less careful. The narrative had shifted from scandal to reckoning. Evelyn avoided the cameras, slipping out through a side exit with Reynolds. In the car, she leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. "I keep thinking there will be a moment when it feels finished," she said. Reynolds glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "It doesn't work like that." At home, Margaret Carter watched the news with the volume low. She turned it off when Evelyn walked in. "Eat something," Margaret said. Even storms pause. They sat together in the small kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. Evelyn pushed food around her plate, appetite gone. "People are calling me brave," she said. "I don't feel brave." Margaret smiled softly. "That's because bravery is what you do when fear doesn't get to vote." The next morning, a letter arrived from a former club employee. Handwritten, careful. It thanked Evelyn for listening, for staying, for not turning away when it would have been easier to let the system reset itself and move on. Evelyn folded the letter and placed it in a drawer she had started using for things she didn't want to lose track of. Proof not of wrongdoing, but of consequence. At Hawthorne Country Club, the board convened again. This time, the agenda was different. Oversight committees, restorative measures, contracts reopened, processes redesigned. The language was unglamorous, necessary, slow. Evelyn listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was precise. "Transparency isn't a press release," she said at one point. "It's a habit." George Whitman nodded, eyes tired but clear. "Then let's make it boring." That afternoon, Richard Hawthorne, Jr. was photographed leaving a federal building. No cuffs, no drama. Just a man in a suit that no longer fit the moment. The image spread quickly. Evelyn saw it online later that night. She stared at the screen for a long moment, searching for something she didn't find. Not satisfaction, not pity, just distance. Reynolds called before midnight. "He's considering cooperation." Evelyn said nothing. "It could shorten this," Reynolds added. "It could expose more." "That's not my decision," Evelyn replied. "No," Reynolds agreed. "It never was." Weeks passed. The pace slowed, deliberate. Investigators moved quietly. More names surfaced. Not all villains. Some simply careless. Some complicit through silence. Evelyn learned how heavy responsibility felt when it lingered, when it didn't resolve neatly, when it demanded consistency instead of courage. One evening, she stood alone in the club library, surrounded by shelves of books no one checked out anymore. She pulled one at random. Meeting minutes from decades ago. Her grandfather's handwriting appeared in the margins. Small notes, questions, warnings. She closed the book carefully. "They didn't listen to you either," she whispered. Outside, the grounds were quiet. The flags lowered for the night. The gates locked, not to keep people out, but to mark an ending. At Richard's house, boxes lined the hallway. His wife's things were gone. The silence pressed in from every direction. He poured himself a drink he didn't finish. The phone rang. He answered it. "I'll talk," he said before the voice on the other end could speak. "But not the way you expect." When the news reached Evelyn, She was sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the worn surface, just like it had the first morning. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. "It's coming," Margaret said gently. "Yes," Evelyn replied, "and so are the consequences." That night, she sat at her desk pen, moving steadily across paper. She wrote not about Richard, but about systems, about safeguards, about the people who would come after her and deserve something sturdier than luck. The story was no longer accelerating. It was deepening. And as the world waited for the final collapse of a man who had mistaken authority for immunity, Evelyn Carter understood something essential. Justice did not arrive in a single moment. It arrived in layers, and she was ready for all of them. The courtroom felt smaller than it looked on television, the air heavier, as if every word spoken there carried weight long after it was said. Evelyn Carter sat in the second row beside Thomas Reynolds, hands folded, spine-straight, eyes forward. The wooden bench pressed cool against her back. Somewhere behind her, a camera shutter clicked and stopped. The judge had made it clear. No spectacle, no noise. This would move the way justice always claimed to move. Slowly. Deliberately. Richard Hawthorne, Jr. entered from the side door flanked by his attorney. He looked thinner. Not humbled. Reduced. The confidence he once wore like a tailored coat now hung loose sleeves, too long, shoulders slumped by the gravity of consequences he could no longer redirect. He did not look at Evelyn. The prosecutor began without flourish. Facts first. Timelines, transactions. The story assembled itself piece by piece, not as a drama, but as a pattern that refused to be ignored. Emails projected onto a screen. Contracts highlighted in yellow. Payments traced through layers of shell companies until they surfaced in places they were never meant to be seen. Evelyn listened, jaw set, heart steady. She recognized phrases she had read in audits, words that once felt abstract, now sharpened by context. Fiduciary duty, willful blindness, conspiracy. Language turned into architecture, building a case brick by brick. When the first witness was called, the room shifted. A woman in her early 60s took the stand, hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She spoke of her catering business, family-owned, decades old, reliable, passed over year after year, with polite explanations that never quite explained anything. "I kept thinking I'd done something wrong," she said, voice tight but controlled. "So I fixed what I could, lowered prices, took loans, cut corners I shouldn't have." The prosecutor asked why she stayed. "Because walking away felt like admitting I didn't belong," she replied. Evelyn felt that sentence land inside her heavy and familiar. Another witness followed. Then another. Different industries. Same story. Opportunity dangled just far enough away to keep hope alive. Then quietly removed. Richard shifted in his chair. When the defense stood, their argument was measured cautious. They spoke of complexity, of oversight failures, of the danger of judging decisions with the clarity of hindsight. They avoided the word intent, like it might infect them. Then came the cooperation. Richard Hawthorne, Jr. took the stand. The room leaned forward without moving. He spoke of pressure, of growth, of expectations. He framed himself as a man trying to keep a venerable institution competitive in a changing world. He admitted mistakes. He acknowledged poor judgment. He insisted he never intended harm. The prosecutor waited until he finished. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said calmly, "do you recall an email you sent to your chief financial officer regarding vendor selection?" Richard hesitated. "I send many emails." She displayed it on the screen. Richard's words stared back at him in black and white. "We need to keep control of the pipeline. Certain voices complicate things." The prosecutor let the silence stretch. "What did you mean by certain voices?" she asked. Richard swallowed. I was referring to inefficiency. And by pipeline decision-making. The prosecutor nodded slowly. And the vendors who were removed. Were they inefficient? Richard paused too long. I didn't think of it that way at the time. The prosecutor's voice hardened slightly. How did you think of it? Richard's gaze flicked just once toward Evelyn. Not with recognition, with calculation. Then he looked away. I thought of it as necessary, he said. The word hung there bare and unforgiving. When Evelyn was called, the room changed again. She stood and walked to the stand. Each step measured the floor firm beneath her feet. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She spoke of the gate, of the laughter, of the assumption that she was an interruption, not a stakeholder. She did not dramatize it. She described it, precisely, like a record that could not be disputed. I wasn't asking for authority, she said. I was asking to be acknowledged. The prosecutor asked what acknowledgement meant to her. It means you check before you dismiss. Evelyn replied, It means you listen even when it's inconvenient. The defense rose for cross-examination. Careful now. Gentle. You would agree, the attorney said, that institutions are complex. That mistakes happen. Yes, Evelyn said. And that one person cannot carry all responsibility for systemic issues. Evelyn met his gaze. That's true. The attorney leaned in slightly. Then why are we here? Evelyn took a breath. She felt the room lean toward her, not demanding but listening. Because systems don't correct themselves, she said. They respond to pressure, and pressure comes from accountability. She stepped down without waiting for permission. The judge called a recess. The room exhaled. In the hallway, reporters waited questions, ready mouths already forming words. Evelyn passed them without slowing. Reynolds stayed close, a quiet barrier between her and the noise. You did well, he said. Evelyn nodded. I told the truth. That's harder, Reynolds replied. Back inside, closing arguments unfolded with gravity. The prosecutor spoke of patterns, of decisions that accumulated until harm was no longer incidental, but structural. The defense spoke of doubt, of caution, of restraint. The jury listened. When they filed out to deliberate, the courtroom emptied slowly. No one rushed. No one spoke above a whisper. Evelyn sat alone for a moment after everyone else had gone. She looked at the empty witness stand, the judge's bench, the seal on the wall. She thought of her grandfather's notes in the margins. Questions no one answered. Warnings no one wanted to hear. Outside, the sky darkened into evening. Hours passed. When the jury returned, the room filled again tension, sharp enough to feel on the skin. The foreperson stood. On the counts of wire fraud, guilty. On conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On abuse of fiduciary duty, guilty. The words landed with a finality that no argument could soften. Richard Hawthorne Jr. closed his eyes. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. It did not comfort him. Evelyn did not react. She felt no surge, no release, just a quiet settling like dust after a long disturbance. The judge set a date for sentencing and struck the gavel once. As people began to move, to speak, to breathe again, Evelyn remained seated. Justice, she understood now, was not a moment of triumph. It was a turning. And as she stood to leave, stepping back into a world that would not stop asking what came next, one truth followed her out of the courtroom and into the night. This was not the end of the story. It was the point of no return. The sentence was delivered without drama, but it landed like weight, finally finding the ground. Richard Hawthorne Jr. stood as the judge read the terms. His hands clasped in front of him, face drained of whatever color authority had once given it. Years in federal custody. Financial penalties that would dismantle what remained of his empire. Mandatory restitution. The words were orderly, controlled, unforgiving. There was no anger in the judge's voice, only certainty. When it was over, Richard turned once, as if searching for something familiar in the room. He did not find it. The deputies guided him away, and the door closed behind him with a final sound that did not echo. Evelyn Carter remained seated until the courtroom emptied. The benches creaked as people stood gathered, their coats whispered reactions. She stayed still, letting the moment pass through her rather than over her. Relief never came. What arrived instead was clarity. Outside, the winter air was sharp, clean, honest. Reporters waited at a respectful distance this time. Microphones lowered questions, already asked too many times. Thomas Reynolds spoke briefly on her behalf. Accountability, due process, moving forward. The words mattered now because they had been earned. Evelyn walked past the cameras and into the sunlight, Margaret Carter beside her. Her grandmother squeezed her hand, once firm and grounding. "You did what your grandfather couldn't finish," Margaret said quietly. Evelyn shook her head. "I continued it. The weeks that followed were not loud. They were methodical. Hawthorne Country Club did not close. It changed. Contracts were reopened. Oversight committees gained real authority. Transparency became a practice instead of a promise. Some members resigned. Others stayed and learned how to listen. George Whitman stepped down voluntarily, recommending new voices take his place. Helen Brooks remained steady and unsentimental, guiding the transition with the patience of someone who understood that trust took longer to rebuild than reputations. Evelyn returned to the club, often not as a symbol, not as a spectacle, but as a presence. She sat through meetings. She asked questions that slowed things down. She insisted on minutes being read aloud, on decisions being explained, on silence being treated as a choice, not an accident. She never raised her voice. The foundation was announced quietly without banners or galas. The Carter Trust would fund legal defense for small businesses facing discriminatory practices, grants for oversight training, scholarships for students whose names carried weight only at their own kitchen tables. The paperwork took months. The impact began immediately. Letters arrived daily, handwritten, careful. Stories folded into envelopes like fragile things. Evelyn read everyone, some late at night, some early in the morning. Each one reinforced the same truth. What happened at the gate had never been about her alone. One evening, long after the building had emptied, Evelyn stood again in the boardroom. The Carter chair no longer carried dust. The table bore new marks from new arguments, new compromises, new care. She ran her hand along the edge and stopped at the nameplate. She did not speak. Some things did not need words. Across the state, in a federal facility far removed from manicured lawns and polished brass, Richard Hawthorne Jr. learned how quiet accountability could be. No speeches, no cameras, just time, just consequence. The world moved on without him, as it always did when power revealed itself to be temporary. Evelyn learned something else during that same stretch of time. Justice was not a thunderclap. It was maintenance. It was choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It was refusing to let systems forget the people they were built to serve. On a clear afternoon, she visited her grandfather's grave. The headstone was simple. The ground frozen hard beneath her feet. She stood there longer than she planned, breath visible in the cold air. "It's steady now," she said softly. "I'll keep it that way." She turned and walked back toward the car, shoulders lighter than they had been in years. Not because the weight was gone, but because it finally made sense. This story did not end with a verdict or a sentence or a headline. It continued in meeting rooms, classrooms, contracts, and choices made when no one was watching. It continued wherever someone decided to verify, before dismissing to listen, before laughing to pause, before judging. If this story resonated with you, show your support by hitting subscribing for more stories, where accountability matters, and leaving a comment with these 3 words. Truth still matters.